I have two brief questions I'd like to ask, if I may.
Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone and you're watching The Daily Question. Today's question of the day: what's wrong with Kristen Bell's ideas about Snow White? Now, you've probably all seen the furore that was making headlines about a week or so back. Kristen Bell comes out and says, well, there's a bit of an issue with Snow White, the Disney film Snow White, because you've got a prince who's kissing a sleeping woman in the forest. And of course, we all know that that's sexual assault, and so I have to tell my kids and instruct my kids about this. Now, when I first heard about this, honestly, my first thought was, this is just, I guess this is going to be the new satanic panic now, where we see things in places where they don't really exist, and so children's fairy tales are now just the latest thing where we are sort of applying this weird satanic panic. It's interesting when you think about the Disney version of Snow White, because there's actually a lot of archetypes in there. There's a lot of what you would call biblical types, in fact, in that particular portrayal of Snow White that are very, very interesting. So if you wanted to see anything in there, you could see lots of really interesting things that are there. Like, for example, the Queen is effectively a type of Satan. She is full of pride. She is driven by her pride, and she has this huge and out of control vanity where she is willing to kill and destroy because of her vanity and pride. That is very much a type of the figure of Satan in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Not only that, but she also targets Snow White, and Snow White is like the pinnacle of creation. In the Disney version of Snow White, she's the pinnacle of this world sort of thing. She is the perfect example of humanity, of creation in this world. And that's very much a type of the figure of Eve in the Old Testament, who is the pinnacle of creation. And also, just like Eve, Snow White is targeted by the satanic figure, by the Queen, and the way in which she targets her is identical. She goes to her in a disguise and she offers her a piece of fruit, and she says, if you eat of this piece of fruit, you will be powerful. The Queen offers Snow White 3 wishes. And we all know in fairy tale mythology that 3 wishes is a type of power. It's almost like the ring of power. And often, in actual fact, these 3 wishes can be a very corrupting factor in the life of characters. So she's offered this power. Eat this fruit and you'll be powerful. You'll have this power. But of course, she eats of the fruit, and just like Eve, there is no power that she receives. Instead, she is cursed with the mark of death. And so then you have her dead. A prince turns up. And what does he do? The prince goes into the grave, he loves her back to life, and off to his castle, heaven, quote unquote. There's a lot of really interesting sort of biblical types that you could see in there and dig out of that if you wanted to go looking and sort of peeling back layers. But sexual assault and rape is not one of the things that is in this story. There's no amount of peeling that is suddenly going to make that real. Like I said, it's very much a sort of satanic panic where people are seeing things where they don't actually exist. There's some real big problems too with this approach, factually. First of all, the prince actually has a prior relationship of love with Snow White. In fact, so does Snow White. They are portrayed in the scene prior falling in love with each other. So there is a pre-existing relationship. It's not simply this prince who stumbles across a female in the forest and then turns to his buddies and says, you know what we do, boys, in this situation? Yeah, we find a lady unconscious in the forest. We just start kissing her. Because that's the implication of what Kristen Bell is suggesting this story is trying to depict here. That's not at all what the story is trying to depict. And even more of an issue here is the fact that she's not sleeping, and the prince knows this. She's actually dead. And this is really, really important, because that changes the whole nature of what's going on here. She's dead. He's bending down to show an act of affection and genuine kindness towards her. It's a mark of respect, this little kiss, this moment that we see depicted in this film. And remember, of course, in the film, and in any sort of visual medium, a kiss is the most simple and straightforward way of showing a genuine moment of intimacy between two characters. But a kiss doesn't actually have to be sexualized in nature in order to portray that intimacy well. It's not simply about kiss equals sex. And that's really what she's trying to do here is there's this sexualization. I guess this is the really big problem for me. There's two areas of sexualization going on here. Number one is the sexualization of human intimacy. So the sort of Freudian obsession with seeing sex everywhere, even where you shouldn't be seeing it. And so in this moment in the forest, there shouldn't be the sexualization, I don't think, of this kiss happening at all. Instead, what we're seeing is something here that is reflected on a regular basis throughout the human experience. So, for example, my father, who died earlier this year, there were several times in the days before we put his coffin in the ground where the coffin was open, we had public viewings, we had family gatherings, and then right up to the moment just before the funeral started, the coffin was open. And on several different occasions during those periods, I bent down and I kissed my dead father on the forehead. It was a profound gesture of kindness and an expression of love that I have for my father. It was a moment of intimacy. But guess what? It wasn't sexual at all, not even in the slightest. And in fact, in many ways, it's a mirroring of the very thing that my father did for me when I was a young baby, a new baby, his first child, and many times he kissed me on the forehead. Again, that wasn't sexual either. But in this case, for some reason, there's this need to sexualize this kiss. Oh, but Brendan, it's between a male and a female. So what? Are you suggesting that the only form of intimacy that can happen between males and females is sexual in nature? If that's what you're suggesting, then you're going to live a pretty vapid and shallow and I would say meaningless kind of existence. You're not really going to find the deeper things about human connection if that's how you approach everything. But more importantly, we really shouldn't be seeing this sexualization here because it's clear from the story that's not what's going on at all. There is no intent for sexualization. A kiss, as I said, is the very simplest and most effective way to show and to symbolize a connection of intimacy and of love between two characters. But this incident here where all you're seeing is sexualization and not love is very typical of our culture. We've lost sight of the idea that authentic intimacy should flow out of love. Even sexual intimacy should flow out of love. But we live in a culture that has completely flipped that on its head. Now it's like, oh yeah, sex without love, if you want to, it's just a physical contact sport. If you get off on it and they get off on it, as long as you've got consent, what's the big deal, right? Love, optional extra. And so it's not surprising in a culture like that that people now no longer recognize that authentic intimacy should flow out of love and even sexual intimacy should flow out of love. But the primary focus here should be in the thing that should motivate and drive that is that authentic love. And if you don't get that, you're going to look at a scene like this and you're just going to think sex, 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 because there is physical intimacy happening between two characters. It must be all about sex. The other thing that's an issue here is the fact that you are sexualizing the children who watch this film. What you're suggesting is that children are watching this film, young children, and they are so sexualized that they look at that moment and they either think, oh, okay, this is either sexual assault or it's a precursor to rape, or this film is sort of instructing me in some way that this kind of sexual behavior between two adults is okay. That's not what kids are thinking at all. Now, I get it. As I said, we live in this hyper-Freudian culture that sees sex and wants to sexualize everything, but this is not healthy, and this is a very unhealthy example of that very unhealthy problem that we have. Our children should not be sexualized, and we shouldn't be sexualizing them in this way at all. Yeah, sure, you might have had a corrupted childhood, but we all recognize, or anyway, healthy people would recognize, that a child who is the victim of sexualization or sexual assault or sexual abuse at a young age, something awful and terrible has happened to them, not just a crime against their body and their person, but there is also a really evil and pernicious corruption of their innocence that is just so awful and vile about this as well. There's a whole nother dimension going on here, and we recognize that as being deficient. And so when a child is sexualized in some way, we recognize this is not a good thing, and so it shouldn't be happening, and we shouldn't be doing this to our kids. Like I said, our kids are not sitting there, my daughters are not sitting there watching this and thinking about sex in that moment. So let's not impose that upon them, because A, it's not healthy, and B, I think we owe it to our children to actually give them as much of their childhood innocence as possible before the world encroaches on that and actually draws them into these adult concerns. These things will happen in their life and they will come later, but let's not impose that upon them. We need to stop, as I said, sexualizing everything and seeing things that we think are there that are not really there. And there's a much bigger problem, by the way. If she's going to be that literal about her interpretation of that kiss in that film, then basically she shouldn't even be showing her kids that movie, because the literalist interpretation, if you're going to take a literalist, sexualized interpretation of that moment, then what is being depicted in that film is an act of necrophilia. He is kissing, he is violating a corpse. That's what he's doing. So if you're going to be that literalist about it and take this literalist sexual approach where you sexualize this moment, you definitely shouldn't be showing your kids this film, because that's a depiction of necrophilia. As per usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please let me know what you think in the comments section below. And if you like the content I'm creating and you'd like to see more of it, then please support me on PayPal or Patreon. There's a link for both in the video description below. That's right, I can hear my theme music too. I'll see you next week on The Daily Question.